and we're going to start with Kiel versus Dortmund. Kiel beat Dortmund 4-2, feet up, scoring what they would call in hockey an empty net goal at the very end, because Kobel was trying to get an equalizer for Dortmund in the penalty box. The scenes were incredible. For Kiel, I mean, it's a massive win for them, right? And in a situation where they really need the points, especially because all the relegation candidates picked up points this week, right? So it's such a tough situation down there. When you look at the table now, St. Pauli on 14, Heidenheim on 14, Hoffenheim on 14. We get to talk about Hoffenheim as well. And then you already have Kiel with 11, and even Bochum now on 9 points. So, even Union Berlin and Augsburg on 19, Union Berlin on 17, they will be looking over their shoulder now as well. It's tight, so every win counts. And this was a huge win for Kiel, and I think we need to talk about how excellent they were in the first half before we get into the machinations of Dortmund and what it all means, and how they're going to approach Frankfurt, and how Frankfurt are probably going to demolish them, even without Mamouche. We're going to get to talk about that in a moment. But, Stefan, this is such a big moment for Kiel. This is probably up there with that win over Bayern Munich in the DFB Pokal a couple of years ago.
Yeah, it was a huge win for them. It just felt like such a rambunctious atmosphere for Kiel. You had the smoke going off. It was a dark night. Cold Tuesday night, as they say in English football. These fixtures and these kind of venues bring with them a certain type of challenge. Even down to the fact that I thought the pitch looked pretty terrible for much of the game. No offense to the Holstein Kiel groundsmen, but it looked like they were playing on a cow field, to be perfectly honest with you, for most of that match, which might explain some of the errors that Dortmund made. But yeah, Kiel were outstanding. I mean, I thought they were maybe a little lucky. I thought Rosenboom, the right back, potentially could have got sent off quite early on in the game. He made a sliding tackle with studs up against Gittins. He got booked for it. I'm surprised it was a red card, to be honest. And then he kind of tumbled Gittins over like 5 minutes later on a counter-attack, which probably should be a second yellow card. But aside from that, I don't think Kiel really put a foot wrong in this game. They played the perfect counter-attacking football. And I think most worryingly for Dortmund, they saw what Leverkusen did and they more or less copied it. That third goal in particular, where it's just a tap in after the ball's played across the box, is exactly what Patrick Schick did, 2 or 3 times against Dortmund. He missed one of them, obviously. They probably should have scored quite a few. And it was, I mean, I just don't really know where to get started with this Dortmund performance. But you're right, we should praise Kiel for it. I thought Kiel were really, really impressive in the middle of the park. I think that's probably where they won the game, to be perfectly honest with you. I was watching the match thinking time and time again just how poor Dortmund's midfield of Brandt, Sabitzer and Nemcha were. In fact, both of the first 2 goals came about from Brandt and then Nemcha losing the ball, respectively, with their backs to goal, being dispossessed. The Brandt one was suicidal. It was a pass from Benzebaini. I had a throw-in where he just kind of quickly throws it to Brandt with his back to goal in front of his own backline, which, I do feel like kind of sums up Dortmund this season in the sense that, like, youth players, and I don't mean like under 18s or under 19s, I mean like kids 12 years old and under are taught never to make a throw-in like that. And the fact that Dortmund are making such obvious mistakes, and then the second goal was just typical Emre Can rushing the ball through the middle of the park. Nemcha misplaced it, who I thought had a terrible, terrible game alongside Sabitzer. But the point is that I thought Kiel did a really good job of keeping tabs on all 3 of those players. They pressed them. They kept things tight behind them. They couldn't find any space behind Kiel. And as a result, Dortmund didn't really have any opportunity to control this match. And I did kind of walk away from this game thinking just a deep and utter frustration with Julian Brandt. It's maybe not fair to kind of hone in on any individual player after a performance like that, but obviously everything was going wrong on the pitch for them. But I don't know. I must admit, like, over the years, I have kind of found myself defending Brandt because he's such an interesting player. He's such a delight to watch when he's at the top of his game. But I think he is quickly becoming the kind of focal point or the main kind of character that defines this Dortmund team, in the sense that he's just not good enough. I mean, he's good enough at a Bundesliga level to start at times, and he certainly has the technique and ability to shine among other top players. But the fact that Dortmund's captain is this wallflower of a midfielder who never steps up when it's called upon, never seems to have the ability to control a game by himself. And the way that he just kind of shrugged off that challenge for the first goal against Holstein Kiel was just despicable, to be perfectly honest with you. And I don't know. I just find myself kind of thinking, like, there's so much wrong with Dortmund right now, and it absolutely is not down to Julian Brandt, or perhaps not even down to the squad. It's down to the manager or the people that hire the head coach, and blah blah blah. We can spend all night talking about it, but I don't know. I feel like in this game, he in particular was really highlighted as being simply not up to scratch. And the more I think about it, the more I think he's a decent Bundesliga player, but a player who's never excelled to the point where he's deserved to move on from Dortmund. He's never played himself into serious contention to play for a bigger club or a better club at a higher level. And I think it probably sums Dortmund up quite well right now, that they've just kind of turned to him. They've thrown him the captain's armband and said, well, see what you can do with it. There's no real impetus to really get better. There's no impetus to even harbour lofty ambitions of potentially being one of the best teams in German football. It's just this constant thing like, well, we'll hopefully get top four, and then we can all take the summer off and put our feet up, and we'll try again next year. It's just, I don't know. It's just really disheartening, if I'm being perfectly honest with you. And
yeah,
you only have to compare Brandt to the players that are at other teams around him, and I just think he falls well short of the mark. So I don't know. Maybe it's unfair to kind of rant about Brandt. The guys can let us know in the comments. The subscribers always do. Give us some feedback. There's a few Dortmund fans, obviously, and our subscribers are quite vocal as well, which I love. They give a lot of feedback and they talk about these things. But there's a lot wrong with this team. But I do kind of wonder if some fans are beginning to run out of patience with them.
I need to add, Emre Can was the captain for this match.
Oh, yeah. Well, Brandt has been captain for much of the season. I think you're right. Can is still the
nominative
captain. Yeah.
And he was playing in this match as a centre back because Dortmund don't have enough centre backs. Which brings me back to my point that it is probably down to the squad. I have the kicker 11 in front of me for the lineup, and while you were talking here, Brandt received the worst grade of all the Dortmund players from kicker, 5.5. Need to add, in Germany, the best grade you can receive in school is a grade 1, and the worst grade is a 6. A 5.5 is pretty bad. That's a really bad grade. Sets and X has always been the saying, when you failed in class, means like, yeah, sit down, you have got the 6, you're done. He's pretty much gotten that. I mean, he's not the only one. Duranville got a 5, Sabitzer got a 5, Guirassy got a 5, Can got a 5, Schlotterbeck got a 5. Actually, the entire back line got a 5. Kobel got a 3.5, and Gittens got a 4. Only one of all the 4 is also a passing grade, just. So 2 players in that entire starting 11 got a passing grade for this match, and just a passing grade, right? The 4 is just good enough. It's not a good grade at all. So that sums it up, right? I mean, they made changes at halftime. Maximilian Bayer comes on, Anton comes on. Gio Reyna comes on, he scores to his credit, right? And he's been actually pretty good coming off the bench. But we spent one of the transfer shows this week talking about all the potential players that could come to Dortmund, and they've been linked to Zinchenko and Chukwuemeka, and I forgot the third guy from Vega, so the 2 guys from Chelsea, right? And you could probably, Neuschein said today at a press conference, you can't substitute the entire 11. And I mean, he's right, you can, but it is quite telling that they're one of the few German teams out there looking to bring in 3 or 4 guys in this winter transfer window. We're not talking just small signings, we're talking significant signings. And that just gives you an indication that the squad planning wasn't good enough ahead of the season, Stefan. Like they didn't think ahead to manage all the expectations. I've talked about this on Blue Sky, and there's a couple of people that are saying that, oh, with Mats Hummels and Marco Reus were still around, maybe these issues weren't there anymore. It's their leadership that's lacking. I think you add Mats Hummels' leadership to this Borussia Dortmund squad, the thermonuclear reaction would blow up half of Germany because we were in London. We were in London when Mats Hummels' leadership came to the forefront. All right, Stefan, ahead of the Champions League final where he openly clashed with Edin Terzic, and massively jeopardized Dortmund's chances in that Champions League final. He played anyways. It was his last game for the club. There was no going back. Suggesting that Mats Hummels' leadership is missing at this team suggests to me that you haven't paid attention to the news that have been going on around the club. As for Marco Reus, yeah, sure, he's a club legend, but he was a former captain, but he was never really a leader. He was someone that people identified with, but he was not a leader in the team. He was someone who was what the Germans call an Identifikationsfigur, someone who like really identified with the club, but he wasn't the one who would put up the sleeves on the field and say, "Let's go, we're going to do it. We're going to go march forward now." That's not Marco Reus, and Reus was done with German football. His body is done with German football. There is no bringing him back either. So, the leader, there is leadership missing in this team, but it's not the leadership that went, quote unquote, that went out. And I think, squad construction and, getting the mix together and having the right players that can lead this team, that is certainly something that needs to be discussed. You mentioned Julian Brandt as someone who's being asked to be a bigger leadership personality in this team. He hasn't been able to do it. He's probably too quiet and he's probably dealing with too many of his own issues. Marcel Sabitzer comes in from Bayern Munich. He isn't exactly a leader either. In fact, his personality is one of the reasons why he failed at Bayern Munich. It had nothing to do with how he plays on the field, but it's the fact that he was bullied out of that Bayern Munich squad because he wasn't able to stand up for himself, right? Emre Can thinks he's a leader, but his leadership on the field causes more chaos than leadership. And so, but that sums it up, right? Like I just mentioned a bunch of leaders, quote unquote, who are not. And so you have a team that has some talent guys like Gittens, Reina, Guirassy, Duranville could be good one day. Who knows? You have good defenders like Schlotterbeck and Anton, but you have no one on the field that gives direction. And if you don't have anyone on the field that gives direction and you have a weak head coach, this is the situation that you get yourself into.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And as you said, it all comes down to recruitment. And the fact that Dortmund are running around with their hair on fire this month just kind of sums up that fact. And actually, just as you were talking there, I quickly checked the last kind of couple of January transfer windows for Dortmund. And I think that also sums up the fact that this team just never gets properly dealt with. Last January, they brought in Jadon Sancho and they brought in Ian Maatsen because they desperately needed another fullback. Whereas, why does that sound familiar? Both of them did relatively well. But again, they were just quick fixes. They were just temporary solutions to long-term problems. The year before that, they picked up Ryerson and Duranville, spent some money there. Now, this isn't really a bad thing, but you have to bear in mind for people who don't really cover German football, German clubs going out and spending money in January is actually quite uncommon. In the case of the Bundesliga, it typically sums up a club that doesn't really know what they're doing or didn't get their summer transfer window summed up. So that's 2 years running that they've had to basically turn to the January window and hopefully sign people. Okay, maybe Duranville was just a player they picked up because they had the chance to swoop in and pick him up at that moment in time. But they brought in Ryerson because they desperately needed a fullback, and he's done well, much better than they kind of hoped for. But they had to go back and get another fullback the following year. They picked up Jadon Sancho, and now, as we talked about on the bonus show this week, they're picking up like 3 players from Manchester City and Chelsea. A fullback, a left back, a centre back, a defensive midfielder, and some of these guys might work out, some of them won't, but it's the process by which they're going about this that just sums up how dishevelled Dortmund are in a sporting sense. And, and that entirely sums up why, yes, they have had their injury problems, but those injury problems have only exposed the obvious holes in this team. And on top of all that, they've got a head coach in Nuri Sahin, who I don't think is good enough to be a Dortmund head coach. And we've talked about this for much of the season. You don't want to kind of be too critical of a young head coach who's still kind of earning his stripes, but he is a head coach who arrived there, if I'm not mistaken, without any coaching badges. He was brought to Dortmund only because he was a former Dortmund player. He knew the board. And as I've been saying for much of the season, he was more or less a yes man. As we said, the difference between someone like Nuri Sahin and Thomas Tuchel isn't just that Thomas Tuchel's a better head coach. It's also that Thomas Tuchel has much higher standards and demands for the club. A number of top-class head coaches, and Dortmund have been for a number of years now hoping to get by on signing these young guys, not just because they're cheap or this kind of, silly idea that one of them might turn into the next Pep Guardiola or Julian Nagelsmann, but it's also down to the fact that they don't ask too many questions. They don't make too many demands. So this team has been conveniently put together by scrimping and scraping, while most of Dortmund's attention has been spent raiding youth academies in France and England, hoping to find someone that they can polish up and fire off to Manchester United or Real Madrid in 2 or 3 years. And there's very little effort being made to actually build a squad, not only capable of challenging for top four, but also, challenging, God forbid, for the Bundesliga title one day. And that's why the likes of Bayer Leverkusen, Bayern Munich, Leipzig to an extent, but also other clubs like, Frankfurt, who we'll come on to talk about at some point on this podcast, are now leaving them behind because their sporting departments are just leagues and leagues ahead of them.